Hello, welcome everyone to our second remote session of the winter quarter for both the Center for the Study of International Migration. I'm actually Ima Garcia Sanchez, the Associate Director of the Center and part of the leadership team, along with Roger Waldinger, who couldn't be here today and sends his regrets. And also, of course, this is, and we co-sponsor this event with our institutional partners at UC San Diego, the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. So we welcome everybody who is joining us from both UCLA, UC San Diego, and I also see some people from Western Case Reserve. So welcome everyone. And talking about UC San Diego, actually, our speaker today, who is going to be talking about her book, Suspended Lives, Navigating Everyday Violence in the U.S. Asylum System. Her alma mater is actually UCSD, where she received her PhD in anthropology. And she is now a faculty member at Case Western Reserve University. And in addition to Suspended Lives, she's also the co-editor of a 2019 volume titled Technologies of Suspicion and the Ethics of Obligation in Political Asylum. Her work has also appeared in journals such as Ethos and Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, among other venues. And her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, among other sources, particularly the work that she's going to be sharing with us today. And I have to say, I was talking to Bridget for a few minutes before everybody was let in, and I was telling her how beautiful and at times how poignant and moving this book about Cameroonian and other African asylum seekers is. So I'm really happy that she's going to have an opportunity to talk about her work with Cameroonian asylum seekers in particular. Cameroon is an area of the world that, unlike many other international conflicts, for some reason, doesn't make it here in the news too often, which is, it still puzzles me because the situation there has been very difficult for a long time. So I'm happy we have an opportunity to talk about it. And the floor is yours, Bridget. Thank you very much for being here today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ima, and thank you to Roger and Absentia for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm really honored to be able to share more about my research in my book. And thank you to all the attendees who are showing up on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate your time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me just start this here. Can everyone see that? Okay. So this is an image of my book, which actually Ima just showed you, titled Suspended Lives, Navigating Everyday Violence in the U.S. Asylum System. And this book was published at the end of spring last year, 2023, by the University of California Press as part of their Critical Refugee Studies series. And so before I dive into some of more ethnographic analyses and arguments in the book, I just want to speak in broad strokes about the book and to situate it theoretically, and also to give some contextual information that I think is important as I move into talking about some arguments in the book. So in the broadest sense, this book, through longitudinal ethnographic inquiry, explores the everyday experiences of asylum claimants. So those who have filed a claim for legal protection within the US government, and many of you are familiar with this definition, but I put it here for those who you aren't. This is a definition of a refugee, which is also the definition to which one must meet if they're to be declared, to be granted asylum. And so I'm working with people in my study who have filed a claim, who are trying to meet this definition or prove their deservingness of this definition, which we'll talk about. In the Midwestern United States. So my fieldwork was done primarily in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of Minnesota. And more specifically, in this book, I traced the lived effects, so the emotional, embodied, and social effects of being subjected to particular forms of governing and technologies of power that are associated with the US asylum regime and of occupying the status of asylum claimant. So the specifics of which I'll talk to you about today. Theoretically, this book sits at the intersection of political legal studies of immigration regimes and analyses of power and subjectivity that are rooted in psychological anthropology. So I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist with specific training in medical and psychological anthropology. And my approach that I've been trained in and that I've carried on has always been very experientially near research. So my focus is on asylum claimants' lived experiences and subjectivities as they emerge within and in dialogue with the US asylum regime. So in this way, I use attention to intimate everyday experiences as a window into the workings of broader structural forces. And throughout, which I hope becomes clear, I see asylum claimants' narratives and life worlds as important sites of critique. So this work, as I mentioned, was longitudinal. It started when I was a graduate student, a doctoral student at UCSD, starting field work as part of my doctoral dissertation in late fall 2009 into 2011, with follow-up trips in 2012, 2015, and 2019, shortly before the pandemic. And this data collection was with 26 affirmative asylum claimants, and I'll get to a second and exactly what that means by affirmative. But these asylum claimants were a mixed nationality sample, but as Ima has suggested, I really focus on Cameroonians from the northwest province of Cameroon who were subjected mostly to conflict that had started and then renewed violence really exacerbated this, which I can talk about in this talk. So I did unstructured interviews, life history collection, and participation. I mean, so this was really intensive field work where I spent my days with asylum seekers in their homes, their jobs, places of worship. I accompanied them to errands and to very bureaucratic appointments and legal proceedings. But I also collected data among institutional actors. So I did interviews with immigration advocates and attorneys. I attended legal immigration law trainings, and I spent lots of hours in immigration court, attending and observing hearings. And I was granted, with much persistence, I would say on my part, a unique opportunity to actually interview asylum adjudicators. So asylum officers who hear and assess and make decisions on asylum claims. And I'll return to that in a bit. So affirmative asylum seeking, for those of you unfamiliar, I have a note that these are affirmative asylum claimants. And affirmative asylum claims are filed with the Office of Citizenship and Immigration Services, so USCIS, which is within the Department of Homeland Security. And USCIS is considered by the Department of Homeland Security to be the, quote, humanitarian branch. And it allows asylum claimants to have their case heard by an asylum officer who can make a decision on their case. So a person can file an affirmative claim regardless of legal status, provided they have not been apprehended by DHS. An asylum officer then can deny or grant the asylum claim outright, which happens not as often as the third option, which is to refer the asylum claimant to immigration court, where then they are entered into removal proceedings at the level of the Executive Office for Immigration Review, EOIR, which is housed in the Department of Justice. And so this is different than defensive claims, which we often hear a lot about, which bypass the USCIS level and are filed directly in immigration court. So why does this all matter? You know, why study affirmative asylum claimants? Why in a midwestern city? And I really feel that sustained attention that I give to a claimants in a city that's really not often associated with asylum, as we think of often, at least in the public imaginary, as asylum being something that's really specific around the border, for example. I think this is critical, this attention to sites that are considered interior or outside of this, to really understanding the reach and scope of the pernicious effects of immigration policies and discourses on the lives of those who seek refuge within our borders. And I've had a few immigration advocates and attorneys tell me in a kind of confused way, but they'll say, but don't affirmative asylum claimants like have it so much easier, right? Don't they live a normal life? And they juxtapose this with the experiences of some of their defensive applicants who are subjected to mandatory detention or expedited removal. But I'm always a little taken aback by this because my data have really told a different story. My interlocutors' experiences and narratives in no uncertain terms have identified the US asylum process, even the humanitarian branch of this, as productive of novel forms of suffering. And I hasten to add that the skepticism and ambivalence or hiddenness of the experiences of affirmative claimants is not ubiquitous among legal scholars. Jason Zubro, who is a DC-based immigration attorney and advocate who also runs a great blog called The Asylumist, has for years reported on the systemic problems with the affirmative system, and particularly as it relates to a growing backlog. So I think many of us are familiar with the backlog currently in immigration court, which has just reached 3 million. But affirmative claims within CCIS are currently at close to 1 million. And Zubro has called this a hidden immigration crisis. So though affirmative asylum claimants like my Midwestern based interlocutors have materially different experiences than defensive claimants, these different pathways of entry into the asylum system are also part of the same governmental apparatus, part of the shared continuum of violence that I elaborate on in this book. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting, of course, that life in detention is the same as life outside it. My interlocutors who filed affirmative claims in this Bloomington, Minneapolis site were for the most part not subjected to these really egregious forms of violence that are epitomized by the kind of spectacular violence facing asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. Yet I think it's critical that attention to what Bob Lopez calls the hyperviolence of detention and deportation not render other forms or other migrants' experiences of violence invisible. And it's exactly the normalization and routinization and invisibility of these bureaucratic violences embedded within these putatively humanitarian processes that my book aims to disrupt. So before I turn to talking about these different forms of violence and their lived consequences, I want to first stop to pull focus and attend to the ideologies and assumptions undergirding these forms of governing for a moment. So asylum seekers are subjected to what I have come to understand as an ethos of suspicion that surrounds asylum and asylum seekers. And this institutional ethos of suspicion positions asylum seekers as potential threats, economic siphons, malingerers, or otherwise bogus asylum claimants. While migrants and refugees have always been treated with some level of suspicion, the increased criminalization and securitization of asylum in both the US and globally, we see this around the world, has meant that humanitarian frames are increasingly supplanted by a growing focus on border control and national security. So the casting of asylum claimants as morally suspect others then in turn gives rise to these range of techniques and practices of managing, policing, and surveilling these putatively or presumed to be suspect subjects. And this ethos of suspicion, or what scholars have described as a culture of suspicion, informs how cases are adjudicated. This is reflected, I think, in current denial rates that hover around the 65, 70%. And this, for those of you who know anything about asylum adjudication, right, there are vast, vast disparities in grant and denial rates that are based on certainly the nationality of claimants, but also immigration court place and immigration judges. It's highly discretionary, but all to say that there are more claims are denied than granted on a national and often regional level. So a key factor in these evaluations of asylum claimants has to do with the presumptive distinction between economic migrant and humanitarian refugee. This becomes a way, as Seth Holmes and Heidi Castaneda have described, as, quote, morally delineating the deserving refugee from the undeserving migrant. Thus, the asylum process is more than a set of political legal processes, but also social moral ones as well. And we know, of course, And well, I just say this image that comes from the UNHCR, where it says refugee or migrant word choice matters, I think really speaks to the kind of moral evaluations that are embedded in these categories, but also the ways in which these categories have become naturalized and normalized, and really obscuring the fact that these are cultural historical constructions. And we know, of course, that the reasons for migration are complex, and that these distinctions, this binary, really fails to map onto lived realities. It's not only untenable, but as Rebecca Hamlin reminds us, it's a dangerous legal fiction. And yet it's always striking just how much this remains a cornerstone of asylum adjudication. And this is something that my interviews with asylum officers confirmed kind of over and over again. Categories and discourses surrounding deservingness are also highly racialized, and scholars of critical race theory have long underscored the racial logics that are embedded in immigration law and policies. In addition to such scholarship, I also find the work of sociologist Lucy Mablin instructive. So Mablin has argued that legacies of colonialism and colonial hierarchies of differential human worth have been fundamental to the construction of asylum seekers as undesirable and excludable. So with all this in mind, asylum claimants then are caught in this process. They're in this very system that will produce them as either deserving legitimate or undeserving illegitimate. Within this highly protracted transitory space, asylum claimants are what I've described as simultaneous citizens in waiting and deportees in waiting. My friend Hassan, an asylum seeker from Pakistan who was facing persecution based on his sexual identity, put it this way when I asked him what it was like to be an asylum seeker in the United States. He said, you come here for freedom, but then you're locked in. They may just send you away at any time. So in a way, it's even worse. I came to this country to be an openly gay man and live a life where I can be free. I feel it. I feel it's there, but I can't touch it. You get a taste of it, but you're not allowed to have it. And maybe it'll be taken away from you forever. It's really very painful. And so here, this dual positionality is eloquently and painfully evoked by Hassan as he captures the asylum system as productive of both hope and despair, possibility and foreclosure. And while Hassan underscores the idea of protracted periods of uncertainty as productive of his distress, this was but one form of bureaucratic violence that I came to understand and subsequently elaborate upon in this book. So then how do I understand this, right? So to ethnographically explore how the institutional techniques of governing associated with asylum came to really shape in often negative and harmful ways subjective, affective, and social lives, I begin with the claim that the numerous institutional techniques of governing and disciplining asylum claimants constitute a continuum of violence. And here I draw on this term that has been coined by Shepard Hughes and Bourgois. This idea of the violence continuum they introduced to account for but differentiate forms of violence ranging from torture and genocide to violences of poverty and social exclusion. So really to account for this range of violences. And by positing the US asylum system comprises a continuum of violence, my goal is first to expose these bureaucratic forms of governing that are often normalized and invisible as forms of violence. And second, to elucidate their often deleterious subjective effects. And I want to note here that these bureaucratic practices work as technologies of power precisely because of their normalization and invisibility. So my interlocutors contended with multiple forms of violence, from less overt and symbolic forms of harm and dignity assaults to more direct physical and or structural forms, all emerging from this institutional ethos of suspicion that I've addressed. The frame of a violence continuum captures how these multiple forms of violence had their own subjective and affective consequences, as well as having cumulative and synergistic effects. So what then do these violences, what are these violences? And though I engage, of course, in my book more deeply with these, I want here in this talk to briefly enumerate them in order to provide a sense of the scope of everyday violences to which my asylum-seeking interlocutors were subjected and that asylum seekers to this day are still So there were moments in which time and waiting was foregrounded and more palpably present. But it was also the case that temporal violence, or what I've come to frame as the violence of waiting, was an overwhelming and overarching pervasive facet of asylum seekers' lived experiences. The asylum claimants I knew during my study, and again, this started, over a decade ago, waited on average about 2.5 to 3 years for a final decision on their cases, and many of them waited over 5 years, and some for longer. And over the course of my fieldwork and into the current moment, these delays have reached really astounding lengths, due in part to an enormous backlog that I mentioned before. So as of 2022, the average wait time for an affirmative asylum claim, so this claim that's filed with CCIS, so a claim for someone to actually have an asylum interview, this currently stands at more than 6 years. For claims in front of an immigration judge, asylum seekers are looking at an average of 4.5 years of a wait time. So this waiting then is protracted, to say the least. And in my analyses, I approach waiting as both an institutional technology of power and a phenomenological state. By the title of my book, Suspended Lives, I call attention to asylum seekers' descriptions of their lives within this space of uncertain and ambivalent refuge. So asylum claimers describe to me really consistently throughout my work their experiences of the asylum process in terms of immobility as life trapped, stuck, hanging, suspended, on hold, frozen, all metaphors of what Ghassan Haj calls stuckness. The enforced waiting that my interlocutors experience was best understood, as I argue, as a kind of existential limbo, a particular subjective orientation or mode of attention in which the asylum process in its current moment was seen as the locus of suffering, and in which meaning-making and life in general were made challenging. So Eric, one of my close Cameroonian interlocutors, put it this way: it's like always limbo, 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 limbo. You don't know what to do today, you know? Sometimes it's hard for me to sleep. I can't shut my brain off because of that limbo, that uncertainty. You know, it's so unsettling. I try not to worry about the things that I don't have control over, but sometimes I can't help it. This is my life. So using this position of suspended life as my point of departure, however, does not reduce asylum seekers to passivity. Rather, this allows for an investigation into how they actively forge lives in a space that they themselves defined in terms of immobility. So my approach here to analyzing the violence of temporality or the violence of waiting has really responded to recent critiques of recent work that really critiques the uncritical use of frames such as limbo or liminality to describe displacement. So thus, rather than assume a state of limbo as or a state of waiting as inherent to displacement or to asylum seeking, I analyze in this book the experiences of limbo as a politically and bureaucratically produced phenomenon. So my interlocutors often describe protracted waiting and states and these states of uncertainty through the language of violence itself. And this was at first really striking to me, but it became almost ubiquitous in the way that people would describe this. So they described their sense of limbo and the sense of waiting and uncertainty using terms and words like a war, a psychological game, a form of torture, a kind of trauma. Eric's claim that his sense of limbo interrupted his ability to know what to do today was echoed by so many others. The violence of waiting disrupted asylum claimants' sense of life trajectories, the life of emplacing and imploding their lives. It reshaped their experiences of the past, the present, and the future. So, asylum claimants could at turns be made both visible and invisible. What I call the violence of invisibility refers to the harmful effects of technologies of surveillance and policing, as well as institutional opaqueness. A key aspect of asylum seekers' subjective experiences of the asylum process relates to what I've come to label a paradox of visibility. Being visible to the state by lodging a claim with the US government This was a necessary step towards the desired, but of course not promised, legal status and protection. But it also meant for asylum seekers being subjected to the racialized, criminalizing gaze of the state. At the same time, while the asylum system produced applicants as hypervisible subjects, the workings of that very system remain largely opaque or invisible to asylum seekers themselves. So I consistently documented my asylum-seeking friends' sense of dehumanization, demoralization, and frustration that arose from the illegibility of asylum bureaucracies. For example, they were often unable to access reliable information about their status of their claim. There's a number you could call, and it had an automated, you type in your called alien number, and it would just be an automated number. Actually getting to talk to a person was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Reasons for cancellations or rescheduling of asylum hearings or interviews, which happened not infrequently, were shrouded in mystery. The justification for an asylum denial was often distilled to a generic single line of text. And consequently, asylum claimants would approximate knowledge of the asylum system through informal channels. Stories and rumors, particularly surrounding detention and deportation, circulated in communities, but often in fragmented or unfounded forms. So these incidents of unanswered phone calls, lack of access to information, stories of arbitrary detention, these were institutionally normalized as kind of bureaucratic humdrum, kind of process and aspects of the asylum process. But I want to see these bureaucratic processes and practices of illegibility and opacity as technologies of power, which engender states of fear and anxiety for applicants, or what Juan Thomas Ordonez has described as a state of confusion. And I want to stress that this confusion, anxiety, and fear, and I stress this in my book, or rather the institutional manufacturing of confusion and related emotions, is not a side effect of the asylum system's bureaucratic complexity, but is rather integral to its very operation. It works to distance asylum claimants from the asylum process, facilitating their exclusion and marginalization. And so the violence of visibility was epitomized by a program called the Intensive Supervision and Appearance Program, or ISAP, many of you may be familiar with. And this was one of ICE's alternatives to detention programs in which many of my interlocutors were enrolled. And in fact, Minneapolis-St. Paul was one of the pilot sites for this program that started just a few years before I started my fieldwork there. And so ISAP requires what are called its participants to account for their whereabouts 24/7. They have regular check-ins at the ISAP office, and surveillance methods include the use of GPS ankle monitoring bracelets, which you see here, random home visits, telephone check-ins. And in contradiction to its moniker as an alternative to detention, my interlocutors experienced ISAP as a thoroughly carceral and deeply humiliating, painful, and dehumanizing program, an experience that generated both intra and interpersonal ruptures. The institutional production of asylum claimants' economic and social structural precarity constitutes another form of violence associated with U.S. asylum bureaucracies. As they engage in their often protracted quest for legal protection in the U.S., my interlocutors found themselves lacking material resources, exacerbating their sense of vulnerability. Legally and politically categorized as non-citizens, asylum claimants do not qualify for any housing assistance that relies on federal or state aid. Under federal law, non-pregnant, adult asylum seekers without children living with them, which described all of my asylum seekers, research participants who came, with the exception of one person who came with a child, but everyone else came alone and left children behind and family behind. They do not qualify for any or most federal or cash assistance programs in states. In addition, asylum claimants are not immediately authorized to work. The law requires that there's a mandatory wait period for an asylum application. After it's filed, there's a time before asylum seekers can even apply for a work permit. And it's noteworthy that the United States is the only identified developed country to simultaneously bar asylum claimants from immediate access to work and access to any governmental support. Human Rights Watch has said that this effectively denying asylum claimants their, quote, fundamental right to livelihood and the many other economic and social rights that depend upon it. Lucy Mablin has called this, in the context of the UK, a kind of purposeful impoverishment. Such precarity has, as then you can imagine, very real, stark material and existential consequences. Asylum claimants would literally wonder how they were to put food on the table or clothes on their backs in the interim period, which again could be very protracted, before they could secure an employment authorization document. And many of my interlocutors spent time couch surfing or even in homeless shelters. They went without food, they skipped meals. And beyond these material effects, in my book, I note that there were numerous relational and personal effects of socioeconomic exclusion, particularly as threats to asylum claimants' sense of identity and dignity that this kind of precarity engendered. You know, it's very humiliating to lose your independence, Sharon, Cameroonian asylum seeker, told me. I'm so uncomfortable being at the mercy of someone else. You know, no one wants to keep a person in their home whom they don't know, who doesn't contribute. I look into their eyes and I can see I'm a burden to them. Delays in work permits and institutional barriers to employment for asylum claimants also meant that they were unable to fill their gendered and cultural roles as provider of loved ones in their home country. As Ahmed's narrative underscores, I want to work. If anyone could give me a job, I would work any job, that's no question, but I have no document. So the cruel thing is, how can I survive? Before you win your asylum case, you're nothing. And the government's not helping me. And now my family and I are all suffering. It's very bad, really, very, very bad situation. Ahmed's narrative also speaks to a key aspect of the everyday violences of the US asylum regime, be it the violences of surveillance and policing, the weaponization of temporality, or social structural precarity. And this is that the effects extend far beyond the bodies and lives of asylum claimants who are the immediate target. The effects of the asylum regime's bureaucratic violences are shared by social and familial relationships, including those far across the globe. At the same time that people were asylum applicants, they were, of course, also many other things. They were mothers, they were fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, political comrades, activists, preachers, and friends. So the existential limbo of asylum seeking was transnationally embodied, and particularly salient to asylum claimants and their loved ones, and I really think that this is impossible to overstate, was the pain of family separation. And here, though asylum claimants made decisions to leave behind children and loved ones when they sought refuge in the United States, these were decisions that they made as with the idea of saving themselves as a kind of family sacrifice that would ensure future family reunification and safety, as illusory as that sometimes came to be. It was the policies, however, and the failures of the US asylum system that are productive of such sustained and damaging family separation. And I borrow here from Stephen Lee to understand this form of family separation as a form of what he calls slow death. So drawing on my interviews with asylum officers, as well as my observations in legal proceedings, I focus on a final form of bureaucratic violence within the asylum system that's a little bit different than these other three, and that's what I've called the epistemic violence of asylum adjudication. So this is really honing in and training my eye on the legal context. This is not to say that all adjudication proceedings, asylum interviews, court hearings, involve forms of harm, but I do consider the ways in which the context of asylum adjudication often engendered forms of epistemic violence, where asylum claimants' understandings and articulations of their experiences were often effaced, devalued, or manipulated. And certainly they were subordinated to legal and political bureaucratic interpretations. This was especially the case with regard to issues of credibility assessments. That was a core feature of asylum adjudication. So I found in talking with asylum officers that they also often conceived of themselves as moral gatekeepers, caught between the humanitarian imperative to grant refuge to those in need on the one hand, and the duty to protect the security of the nation on the other. And here they often referenced economic migrants posing as true refugees as a figure that was particularly threatening to the integrity of the asylum system. They frequently invoked concepts of deservingness and undeservingness and this binary of economic versus humanitarian. And their narratives overall very much reflected the ethos of suspicion or culture of disbelief that I've earlier addressed. And as I show in my book, forms of epistemic violence, like all the other forms of violence I've outlined, had not only material effects, I mean, certainly in the context of adjudication, whether one is granted asylum or asylum status or not was a pretty profound thing that was at stake. But this also had psychological, emotional, and social consequences as well. It's in this way that asylum denials were often experienced as moral assaults. This was excruciating clear when I talked to Solange, a Cameroonian asylum claimant, after she received an asylum denial from an immigration judge, that she was denied on what the judge said was her lack of credibility that stemmed from really, ultimately, which were minor inconsistencies on the details surrounding her brutal rape. She was devastated. And while she knew that this moved her closer to deportation, this was actually not her immediate reaction or concern. She said, it's just hard for me to understand why immigration judge, said that she didn't believe me. I don't know why she said that. Why would she say something like that? I would have been 10 times happier if she just said, I'm not going to grant you asylum. I'll take that. You don't want to grant me asylum. Tell me that. But to give me a reason that breaks my heart, my soul, that just really deepens my wounds. And this was not, just a kind of one-off here. It was really striking to the ways in which, particularly lack of adverse credibility findings, or that really kind of hyper lens of security, of suspicion, really came to be taken up in people's kind of psyches and as a really kind of moral personal assault. This was really striking for people and really uncomfortable, and something that people articulated all the time. So in many ways, adjudicators, I found, tried to shield themselves from the pain that their decisions may have had on asylum claimants. And one salient way that they did this was to distance one salient way they did this to distance themselves was by drawing on this legal mandate that the burden of proof is on the asylum claimants to make their case. So take, for example, this quote from Anthony, a senior asylum officer. He says, a lot of times I'll tell the new officers when they get here, it's like, you have to be able to divorce yourself if you want to be able to sleep at night. You make a decision, the best decision you can based on the information you have at hand, and you let it lie. Our job is to try to help the people, but we're not the ones who are harming them. They still have the burden to make the case. And if we decide against them, all right, you can't sit there and second guess yourself that they're going to be deported and go back and be killed, because certainly that may happen. But you're still not the one killing them. Somebody else is. And I bring this quote up not to minimize or to poke fun at this, but to show the ways in which asylum seekers, asylum officers are socialized into this understanding that there is something kind of inherent of these categories of deservingness or undeservingness, and that it's the burden of proof here. So this effectively creates what Nick Gill has described as moral distancing of adjudicators, and it shifts the responsibility of a denial from adjudicators to the claimants. It's the problem, right, is that they could not demonstrate their proof of deservingness, of protection. And while Anthony may be correct, of course, or is correct, that it would not be the adjudicators, right, that are physically killing an asylum claimant were they to be deported to death, this logic and the narrative of Anthony obscures, that was repeated over and over, obscures the fact that it is through the adjudication process that these categories of deservingness are constructed in the first place. So thus far, I have shown that the pernicious effects of the asylum system's violence continuum, including effects that extended far beyond the US and asylum claimants themselves. And I really am not being hyperbolic when I say that I really had many instances in my fieldwork when I witnessed or listened to narratives or experiences of really deep despair and sense of hopelessness. And yet, despite the force of these bureaucratic violences, asylum claimants were not fully determined by them. I have found it really vital to highlight the myriad ways, big and small, overt and subtle, that asylum claimants as creative social actors endure this asylum process. And I see this endurance as a form of refusal, a refusal to be interpolated as or reduced to state and institutional labels and interpretations of them as morally suspect others. I frame my interlocutors' narratives, for example, of past political activism and more as a moral enterprise and stories of freedom fighting that so often entered into my conversations with my Cameroonian friends. I take these to be critical counter stories or counter narratives that importantly work to push back against the racist, stigmatized gaze of the asylum regime to which they were forced to confront. And to understand, though, asylum claimants' endurance, I have engaged with theorizing around agency that moves us beyond ideas of overt resistance to attend to the everyday forms of survival and navigating situations of constraint. Seen from this vantage point, asylum claimants' seemingly mundane acts emerge as agentic responses to the violences imposed upon them. My interlocutors often stressed a desire to, for example, keep busy, free time spent window shopping at thrift stores, hours-long walks through the day, weekends spent in the kitchen cooking pots of Cameroonian stew and fish rolls. These were all very meaningful activities in that they offered respite from the pain of state-produced limbo. They provided spaces of social connection, and they allowed for the appreciation and expression of asylum claimants' full subjectivities. The longitudinal nature of my research has allowed me to examine the longer-term effects of the asylum regime's violence continuum. And as I turn to closing this talk, I want to look at what I have called the aftermaths of asylum decisions. In the book, I follow these aftermaths in the wake of different legal outcomes. So the granting of asylum, what's considered voluntary departure, not experienced necessarily as voluntary departure, and deportation. Though I'll talk here today just about the granting of asylum and the effects that that had. Beyond the profound material and existential consequences of being granted asylum, beyond the profound material and existential consequences of being granted asylee status, this granted legal protection, a sense of existential protection, access to new kinds of assistance from the state and local bureaucracies. My interlocutors, nonetheless, my interlocutors experience a granting of asylum simultaneously as a form of moral recognition and legitimation. So I was always struck upon my friends and my interlocutors receiving asylum status determination and being granted asylum, really took this up and talked about this and feelings of feeling worthy or an immediate sense of belonging that was that came with this conferral of asylum. At the same time, though, my asylee friends also pointed to what I've identified as a kind of affective debris of their time spent embedded in the U.S. asylum regime. It was not uncommon, for example, for asylees to talk about their newfound sense of belonging and goals of gaining citizenship, while also highlighting the enduring emotional impact that aspects of the asylum process left. Louise, for example, who had been subjected to modes of surveillance and accusations of fabricating elements of her testimony, who was eventually, after 6 years granted asylum, told me, there will always be so much hurt because for so long, they didn't believe me. They said I was lying, and that will always hurt me. Likewise, Ahmed lamented the protracted period in which he felt his life was on hold. Talking about this idea of lost time, which was really highly salient for people. And he told me, asylum seeking takes so much of you. It's just gone and it never comes back. Half of your life. And I'm not just talking about number of years, but part of you. Like you become really weak, vulnerable, you feel worthless, just like you're nothing. And I don't think you can ever recover from those feelings. And this was someone who, upon getting asylum status, promptly enrolled in graduate classes and started his own business. So he was kind of holding both of these things at the same time, kind of striving towards this kind of new life, while also feeling this kind of irreparable loss. So I want to just end with a couple of thoughts about how these findings point to some implications for change, and what does this mean for the asylum system. So I don't want to spend, I'm happy to spend more time with this. And in my book, I identify what you see on the screen, some ways in which I think these findings have really kind of actionable ways of thinking about how this might be changed. And at the broadest sense, this is really about shifting away from the criminalization of asylum and suspicion of asylum seekers, and kind of rehumanizing the system. Many asylum seekers just lamented how inhumane, dehumanizing this process is. And there were so many moments in my fieldwork where I was just witness to this kind of acts of inhumanity or dehumanization, that sometimes seemed so kind of small, but made such a difference and made such an impact on people. So people, crying in the ISAP office about, why their ankle monitoring bracelet was going off at all hours, and literally, the case manager at the desk avoiding their gaze. Moments, of the seeming absurdities in immigration court, where people's where people were subjected to lines of questioning about, that they said they were pushed in a closet at one point, and then said that they were, forced into a closet or hid in a closet, and all in this context of, them narrating the story about the actual murder of family members. And this was kind of honing in on this idea that this was somehow making them a less credible applicant. So there were these moments that I felt really compelled that there were these opportunities, right? These spaces for change. So I've tried to identify them in some small ways in this book. So things like increased access to legal representation. This is, of course, not a new suggestion. We know that asylum claimants without legal representation, and many or most of my claimants were able to get pro bono legal representation, but those without it face a 90% denial rate. I think the experiences of my interlocutors on the alternative detention programs point to movements to redirect funds from alternatives to detention and into things like legal representation, and certainly reducing the wait times. And, I was writing this, it was going to press in, 2022, and now the kind of exponential growth of these things has made these problems, I think, even more seemingly entrenched, but all the more important. And increasing and expediting access to employment, and at a very basic level, increasing transparency and the legibility of these bureaucratic processes. So in somewhat contradiction to a seeming contradiction, and perhaps this slide should say and instead of but I also have been lately kind of thinking about, and I want to touch this, and maybe this is something if people are interested in the Q&A, but been thinking more broadly about how to talk about or how to propose changes with two things in mind. And one is been thinking about how we might, or if it's possible, to suggest internal changes without reproducing the categories or reifying these problematic categories that are already embedded. So for example, how do we negotiate the stance that our categories upon which asylum is based are problematic to begin with, at best, but also see opportunities for smaller actionable change? Does this inadvertently reproduce these categories or these hierarchies? What Susan Coutine has long talked about, these prototypes of deservingness. Are we unwittingly reproducing these things if we're not seeking for more radical change? And can we do both of these at the same time? Likewise, and I know many others are thinking and talking about this as well, but I've wrestled with the challenge of talking about how to decriminalize immigration. Again, I think this has come up in this talk, but certainly in the book I write about this, the kind of humiliation of being treated, as asylum seekers would always tell me, as a criminal, was ubiquitous. And people found this kind of criminalization of something that they found to be their right, their claim, their right to protection, their moral deservingness of protection, was highly, highly painful. But how do we talk about this in a way that honors the pain of their experiences, but doesn't unwittingly leave those very mechanisms of criminalization unscrutinized? or in critique. So for example, does anyone deserve to be treated with surveillance and ankle monitoring and detention? So these are kind of broader questions that I'm bringing up. So all to say in closing that I raise these questions about the broader implications and challenges because I've thought about, I really think we need to think clearly about the place of ethnography in speaking to issues of immigration policy. So Sarah Horton, for example, has posed that anthropologists serve as ethical witnesses that are compelled to action. And I've been inspired by similar thinking with scholars like Whitney Duncan and Kristen Yaris, who are working on ideas around anthropology's accompaniment. And most of all, though, I think that these questions that I've just posed, right, are embedded in the stories, experiences, and lives of the asylum seekers who we've had the privilege to get to know over the years. My book tells a story of violence, but not victimhood. My interlocutors' words and experiences serve as a powerful indictment of the U.S. asylum regime, exposing it as much a site of harm as potential refuge. And it implores us to do better. Thank you. And I just want to thank, this is a thank you slide and also a discount code for the book is there as well. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to stop sharing now, Ima.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for this wonderful talk. You've really given a wonderful overview of your book, and you certainly have given us a lot to think about. And so I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. And while the audience are gathering their thoughts and putting their questions together, I mean, first, I really do appreciate one of the things that you ended with is how we continue to reflect on our own positionality as scholars who are doing work and learning and accompanying these, like very vulnerable populations. Kristen Yaris actually was with us last year for a talk. We also invited her to give a talk for the center, and she was also talking to us about this idea of accompanying, and one thing that, so I think that's an important question, how we continue to reflect about our own positionality. And I also had a question about adjudicators, right? That is also about how asylum adjudicators reflect, whether critically or not, about their own position, and I was struck about a couple of things. I mean, I have to say, for full disclosure, I'm particularly interested in this because I've also used the like the conceptual framework of epistemic injustice in some research. And, I find these topics incredibly important, when somebody has already being objected to a tremendous harm. It's another layer of harm when on top of it, somebody tells you, well, we don't believe that you were subjective. It's a whole another wound that gets, and so I have two questions about this. I was very struck by the quote of the senior adjudicator, because in the admission that, well, if they go back and they get killed, it's sort of not your fault because you're not killing them directly, or you're not the one who is doing whatever it is that they do to kill them. But there is also an admission, implicit admission that mistakes are made, that you do send people back who have a legitimate asylum claim, that they have fear from their lives, and that they are being sent to these incredibly dangerous situations in which that they are going to get killed. That's an implicit sort of. So I wonder how are they ever, of the adjudicators that you interviewed, are they ever self-reflected about any of these? And I'm thinking in particular, by now, it's part of popular culture to know that memory. It's not just academics who know this, that when you've gone through a lot of trauma, sometimes the memories are not so distinct. I mean, there's been a lot of, like popular culture discussion of this, even in relation to the Me Too movement and other things. So I just wonder if the adjudicators ever reflect about any of these and have some sort of self-reflection or critique. And the second part of the question is that you said that they tend to basically privilege objective evidence to the asylum narratives, asylum seekers narratives. What are some examples of what an objective, evidence would be considered? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question, and the objective, of course, is in quotes, and I'll get to that. But this question, Ima, that is a great one, both of them that you're asking about the self-reflection, and I think you're absolutely right in that. And there were lots of moments like that, like in these. Well, it's not my fault. There was also this kind of admission, right? And certainly when they granted an asylum, there was a narrative of them saving lives, that, right? So it was the disavowal of responsibility only when it was a negative outcome. Asylum officers in particular also relied on this kind of 2 bites of the apple, where they didn't have the kind of final authority, right? Even though often judges uphold asylum officers' decisions, but so this question about if there was self-reflection, I think that there was a sense in which there was some sort of kind of self-protection. I mean, I think the self-reflection would invite, this idea of like vicarious traumatization almost, right? And so I think that the kind of work that these ideas did, like this moral distancing kind of work, protected them from this kind of sense, sense of taking any sort of responsibility. But I see this not just about individual adjudicators, but really reflective of this larger process that socialized this idea. So people talked about, well, this is an impossible job. You will never know if someone is being, if you'll never know if someone's telling you the truth. And yet then they tried to kind of use these quote objective, these two questions kind of go together, right? They would try to use these objective ideas to, like, country origin reports or objective evidence, actual kind of like bio data or something like that, right? Scars, things like that. But I think it was really interesting in these discussions I had with them, how unstable and uneven these politics of knowledge and knowledge production were. So, for example, another example of this really briefly is a woman I was interviewing, an asylum officer, and she was telling me about this case in which here's a huge an objective thing, which is the use of dates and names and consistency, right? And so she was saying, she was describing this man when she was interviewing him, and she was thinking he's making this up because he couldn't get his dates straight. And then he described feeling really hot when he got up to these wires. And in that moment, she said she realized he was telling the truth because he was describing being electrocuted. And then she followed that by saying she couldn't grant him. She had to deny him because his dates were a mess. So here you see, right, this subordination of this evidence, right? So here she is admitting that she recognized the kind of credibility and validity in what he was saying. And yet she's trained to be socialized into this orientation where certain kinds of knowledge hold more truth. And yes, there were asylum trainings, right, that had trauma trainings in them, and they all received these. But this was also equally met by fraud trainings, right? That they were specifically told how to root out liars. And so this orientation, I think, of finding the liars in many ways, not for all adjudicators, but trumped this idea of extending the kind of benefit of the doubt. So, and I think there's lots of ways that asylum law has changed to really kind of facilitate those kind of things. But in terms of these objective knowledge or forms of evidence, it's really things like country condition reports, consistency in dates. But there's lots of inconsistencies in that I talk about in my book. So people would say, well, it should be a coherent narrative, but you should be able to jump around. If you talk too much, that's a bad sign. But if you don't talk at all, that's a bad sign. I mean, I can't imagine as an asylum seeker trying to navigate this landscape. So I don't know if that answered some of your questions, but it's a really complex thing.
It is, and I was very struck by the scar thing, because there are certain things that don't leave outer visible scars, such as violence.
Right, and actually that's often like the point of forms of torture, to not leave evidence too.
Yeah. So we have two more questions. One, Marjorie Oriana, and then in the chat we also have Lori Hart. So Marjorie, you go first, and then Lori.
Great.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for illuminating, all these insights into hidden aspects of the asylum seeking process that is getting so much play and a certain level out in the public sphere, but we don't see the inside process. And I think, but that is where I just want to take the conversation, if you're willing to go there, how you are navigating that larger policy context that we're in as we approach the elections, and as Biden is hardening his position on us. And Trump, never mind. But where I think everyone probably in this room is with you in how to shift from criminalization to humanization, and to humanize the process and reduce the wait time. But that's not where much of the rest of the world is seeing this asylum process at all. So how do we engage with that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's such a great question and such important things to think about. And I have, like probably everyone on this call, have been thinking about these issues with this kind of fearfully thinking about this next election cycle, but even the things that have been happening, throughout the Biden administration. And I think it's really complex, to think about, like, where do you even start addressing and dismantling these things? So, one of the narratives surrounding about like why there's so many people at our border now, listening to these like pundits talking about, well, the language of Trump, there was lower because it was kind of unequivocally, he made it unequivocally clear, that asylum seekers weren't wanted, and Biden's language was more welcoming, and they were trying to trace that. And I find that to be so problematic, that stance, because it's also in some ways still relying on this binary that there are deserving migrants based on the kind of proper mobility versus not. And so if we're leaving intact like those kind of issues, and I think that's kind of where I was kind of going with my discomfort about, I don't know about discomfort, but challenges about thinking through this. So that's that. So, thinking about like, where do we really intervene, in these things? And that this may necessitate a really kind of radical overhaul. And then how do you change hearts and minds? Because asylum particular, but immigrants have become such a kind of scapegoat and a site of all kinds of antipathies, So, so I mean, and certainly thinking on that level, and like, how do you intervene? I think to some extent, and I don't know, hopefully this doesn't sound like a cop-out, but I do think by kind of exposing these things as violences, like these kind of intersubjective moments, or these kind of seemingly mundane bureaucratic, and exposing the kind of harms that they do, that I hope will open this conversation to see the system as less humane than it represents itself to be. Now, of course, that also means getting an audience who cares and wants to think about that, or that's not already thinking about that. And in terms of disseminating this, I've thought about ways to do this. I'm working with one of my former research participants to kind of write a piece that could illuminate some of this. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, all to say that I'm kind of with you, and it's a struggle, and it's certainly a really kind of fraught, and the fact that migrants and their actual bodies, are being weaponized as political tools in this moment is just is horrifying, really.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I didn't expect you have the miraculous.
Yeah, right.
We all struggle with you know, and I'm with you on in terms of ethnography and qualitative work to expose, to make visible, in the hopes that that will open hearts and minds and make. And I think that's all. I mean, maybe that's not all we can do, but that's an important starting point. And I think we all have to struggle with the rest of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori, do you want me to read your question in the chat, or do you want to unmute yourself? I'm happy to do either. I don't know.
Please read it for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will. So Lori thanks you for your important research, and she was moved by the observation on the sense of worthiness and inclusion felt with a positive decision. And of course, that underscores the depth of the argument you were making about epistemic violence. And these are some of the questions that then she posted. I wonder, however, if you could zoom out and contextualize the trajectory of Cameroonian asylum in the context of asylum for African migrants more broadly. Are there more or less privileged groups, for example, and what are the criteria, both chronologically and in the current landscape of migration? And what are the pathways through which the Cameroonians have been able to enter into the process of, and I believe it's affirmative asylum, right? First, this is the defensive. So those are Lori's question. I hope I represented you well, Lori.
Yeah, so that's a great, so if I'm understanding, the first part of that question is just kind of zooming out to give a little more contextual story about Cameroonian asylum. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
In the context of asylum for African immigrants more broadly, and within that, whether there are privileged groups and what would be the criteria.
Yeah.
You know, like a little bit chronologically, but also within the landscape of migration. That's like the first part. And then the second part would be the pathways through which Cameroonians have been able to access the affirmative claims. The affirmative claims there.
Yeah. And so this has been thank you for that question. Questions, these are great. And so to think about in the context of African migrants, and I mean, the immediate thing that I think is important is to think about, you know, that this kind of these categories of deservingness and how people are seen as either worthy or not of inclusion, right, are highly racialized, right? And so, and asylum claimants from Cameroon, and there's been some really interesting work on this. Meredith Toretta does some work on Cameroonian migrants around suspicion, that Cameroonians have traditionally, this is changing, I think, because the violence, I mean, even though this is not front page news of US newspapers necessarily, there is a little bit more attention. And it's interesting to me because when I went and visited my asylee friends in 2019, my Cameroonians, and who really wanted to share with me the like images and stories of the horror that was happening with this renewed violence in Cameroon, they would say to me, see, this was happening when I came a decade earlier, and yet it was so invisible then, right? That idea was so invisible. And a claim, and Cameroonian interlocutors, like early on, would really talk about this another kind of continuum of violence where they felt marginalized and invisibilized in Cameroon, and that was continuing into the United States, because at that time, the denial rates in particular for Cameroonians around the time that I was starting my field work and into the mid part of my field work were particularly high. And it was particularly high based on things about credibility. So this idea that Cameroonians, and I think other, you know, the kind of ways in which these things the kind of gaze of suspicion becomes kind of laminated, right, on people of color, of immigrants of color, that I think was really resonant early with Cameroonians, right? So they felt this kind of double marginalization as not just asylum seekers, but Black asylum seekers. But this was also really informed by class. And so this was really interesting because they often lamented to me, for example, the ways in which more privileged groups that often came from Francophone regions of Cameroon could basically buy asylum, right? And so there was these really kind of class dimensions that kind of there was like the basis of this kind of network, right? And so now I think so there was a way in which, particularly when it came to these kind of violence of surveillance, for example, that African migrants experienced themselves, and I think that this bears out probably, right, that were often subjected to higher rates of these kind of surveillance. So people would tell me, like, when they go to the ISAP office, it's you know, they would say, right, like, who do you see? You see Black and brown people, right? You don't see this. So I think that, and there's been some really interesting and important work lately about just how racist these kind of bias of immigration judges are. And so this landscape then of Cameroon. So then when there was this kind of resurgence, there was a kind of visibility that started, I think, to be on the radar, not of maybe the public, but certainly with some adjudicators, where this was shifting, kind of these lines of deservingness kind of became a little bit more shifting. But I think what happens, right, is that even though asylum is merit-based, right, and there's no quota for asylum, it's really experienced and understood as a kind of limited good, right, as a kind of commodity. And I think that there are these hierarchies then of like who's deserving, who's not, that I think very much become or are very racialized. So I think, you know, you still see this discourse now about African migrants coming through the border, the southern border, right? A feeling that they're not as visible as, say, some other kind of migrants like Venezuelans or whatever, right? So these kind of really, these categories of differential worth and being seen, I think, are highly racialized. So I hope I'm getting at some of those questions in terms of the chronology. So I would, and so right now for affirmative asylum claimants, right, you have to be on US soil. So there are Cameroonians and other African migrants and increasingly large numbers that are coming from the circuitous route, that are coming up through South and Central America up to the border. But largely they're doing that, at least with my interlocutors, in ways because they've been barred from doing it other ways. So my friend, my dear interlocutor, who's become a dear friend of mine, had her son was tried for years to come through legal channels to get a visitor visa, a student visa, family reunification in order to come here and then apply for affirmatively for asylum. He had what he knew would be kind of cut and dry case that would be granted asylum. And yet these other channels were being so restricted. This was during the Trump era. Visas were limited, right? These all things are all in like kind of entangled. And so what happened is he took this really circuitous journey and wound up capsizing and dying on a boat off of the coast of Mexico, trying to get to the United States. And so I bring this up to say that there are other ways in which access to affirmative asylum seeking has been barred that obscures, that happens way off, you know, through other channels. That's not an asylum process, right? So the barring or restriction of visas, of legal pathways makes asylum a much more kind of available but dangerous way to actually get refuge. I don't know if that is answering any of the questions, but it's a really complicated system, I think.
Any other questions? Oh, I think, hold on, it's because... Oh, yes, we have a question on Sergey. Thank you for this great talk and those vivid slides. My question is, what impact do you aim to have on readers, and what do you hope readers will understand or feel after engaging with asylum seekers' experiences?
Yes, thank you. That's a really great question. And so the first thing I would say, right, is that I think that there's two important things that I'd like to say to answer this. So I would say that it's really, I hope, right, by these kind of deep ethnography, right, or listening really to these stories and these everyday experiences of asylum claimants, that it will kind of humanize this process or make this process more meaningful or have an urgency to a reader, right, than something that is this more kind of abstract out there problem, right? So that's one of them. But in doing this, right, and in writing about, and I'm actually grateful for this question because it's been important to me, right, to think about how do you write about suffering and hopelessness and despair while also really honoring people's agentic capacities, right, at the same time. And this is something, so one of the ways in which I have really tried to do this, and I hope that it gets read and interpreted this way, is to look at these stories of suffering and violence. And that's why I say that it's a story of violence and not victimhood, not as a kind of fetishizing of suffering, but to look at this as an actual bureaucratically, politically produced phenomenon, right? So I would love for people, and I hope that people come away with realizing, oh, asylum seekers aren't just kind of suffering subjects, but they're actually, their suffering is actually produced by this kind of apparatus that has these hidden kind of cruelties and hidden kind of violent forms that are kind of disguised or smuggled in through the ideas of kind of routine bureaucratic processes. And so that's so I think that is what I hope to do. I think that ethnography, and I think any stories, right, can help move people. And I think it also gives insight into this. And the last thing I'll say to that is that I was really happy that this book, really honored for this book to be part of the Critical Refugee Studies series, because the whole idea there, right, is that knowledge is co-produced, right? And my research persistence aren't objects of study, but subjects, right, of knowledge production. And so what I really tried to do in representing asylum claimers in this book is to really tell a story that's their story, right? That these are these life worlds and these are these experiences, right? That, of course, that we've co-constructed, but this isn't, this ultimately isn't my story to tell, it's theirs. And I hope that that's conveyed in the book as well. Thanks for that question.
Any other question? I think listening to the questions that Marjorie, Lori, and Sergey just asked you and your answer, and also the last slide that you put for us to consider, how can we even imagine something being done differently? I was thinking, is there, would you have any chronological perspective on how, as asylum seekers become more and more criminalized, more and more subject to suspicion, how the process of adjudication or even the socialization of adjudicators, how that has shaped or informed the socialization process and that administrative process? Would you have any insight on that? And, maybe also that would be one way to start thinking about it, right?
Amy, I really like this question, and you're asking how this might increasing over time, right? This increasing criminalization has impacted adjudication, is that?
Yeah, both, not just adjudication itself, but also even the socialization process that adjudicators go through.
Yeah.
And,
well, I think
what the burden of proof is considered to be.
Right. Well, I think that it's important to understand, right, that asylum adjudicators are also, citizens and social actors in this world, right? So they're subjected to these other kind of circulating narratives, right, that happen. And, the thing I think with asylum, like many other kind of phenomena, but really when we think about this, is that the system, in effect, produces the problem for which it now has a solution, right? So we hear this idea that 70% of asylum seekers are denied, and therefore, the logic goes, 70% of asylum seekers are either bogus asylum seekers or they don't meet the definition, and I don't know how you get to a point where you start to kind of flip that script and get people to see what I think we all see, right, is that it's a 70% denial rate, not because these are bogus asylum seekers, but because we're closing it, you know, we're kind of increasing the denial, increasing our suspicion. We're increasing in small ways. This certainly happened during the Trump administration, and some of this has been maintained in the Biden administration, but small ways in which we're just curtailing, right? Like who and how people can access asylum. At the same time, all these other channels, right, are being restricted as well. So asylum becomes this available and often very dangerously, right, for people to come and seek this, but it becomes this available way to seek any sort of refuge in the United States, right? And so I think we can't think of asylum as separate from other sorts of immigration categories and processes. But I think what happens though, right, like if we think about more people are fleeing these horrible violent conflicts, right? And of course, the United States, if we kind of really zoom out and think about how the United States is implicated. I mean, my Cameroonian interlocutors talked a lot about this, right? About that these were, really kind of motivated, or part of their kind of displacement started with a kind of neo-colonial context of Cameroon. And even though the United States, of course, was not an actual colonizer of Cameroon, right? The idea that what they saw as, Cameroon and America kind of being friendly, right, in bed with each other, kind of facilitated this. All to say, right, that I think as more and more people seek asylum as one available pathway to really both seek refuge from harms in their home countries and to aspire to a good life, right? That this will increasingly then be invented or created or reproduced as a problem to be solved, right? So it kind of all goes hand in hand. I don't know, Emma, if I'm kind of articulating this, but when people talk about the whole system as being kind of broken, I think we're certainly kind of at that point. And I would say, I think that current scholarship and thinking around, abolitionist thought about, detention abolition, border abolition, I think does point a way. I mean, this whole idea of like maybe blowing it up. I mean, that, and I don't mean to speak lib, but I mean, to really kind of rethink about what an actual change really would entail.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, one thing before we all leave and thank Bridget one more time, Warren, several people were asking in the chat and in the Q&A how the recording is going to be distributed, and I'm not sure myself. So if you could say something about that.
Yeah, the files are too large to send it to individual people. It usually gets posted at CCIS, the YouTube channel, and the link is usually sent out to the CCIS distribution list. I can also send the link to you so that you can send it to anyone at CSIM.
Thank you, because they kept directing questions at me. It's like, actually, that's a very good question because I usually am at all these events, so I've never had to check out the recording. But you have several messages of thanks in the chat, and I concur. It's I think it's a very important work to illuminate these stories that people often don't hear about. So we would like to thank you one more time for sharing our work with us and your really wonderful book, and hope that our paths will cross again soon.
Yes. And I just want to thank you very much for having me here, and for everyone in the audience for their generous listening and questions. I am so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we want to thank our friends also at CCIS in San Diego.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.